Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to continue our lessons on InDesign, but we're going to be talking about importing things into InDesign. It's like photos, Photoshop files, vectors, and those kinds of things. I'm hoping that this video will be a pretty brief one. You guys already know most of the stuff from our Illustrator and Photoshop videos, so hopefully this will all be a breeze. There are a couple things that are a little bit different when it comes to importing things into InDesign, but generally most of the stuff stays the same. Like last week, we're just going to hop over to our book file. This is the same one from last week that I saved, so all of this mess is still here. So I've also gone ahead and I added a couple photos to our photo folder here. Some of these are from the Illustrator tutorial. Some of them are just random images that I found. I've also added a Photoshop file right here because we're going to be talking about that later. But you guys can just use whatever images you were planning to use for your book. And these could be like, your postcards, elements from your postcards, that kind of thing. So going back into InDesign, I'm just going to scroll down to an empty spread that we haven't worked on yet, and I'm going to just delete these elements. In general, importing images into InDesign is basically the same as Illustrator. You can definitely just do the thing where you take the image, drag it into InDesign, and just click and drag the thumbnail until it turns into the size that you want it to be. Once again, I will emphasize that you really should have the actual file for the image in a photos folder in your book folder, and this is because InDesign really relies on these links. While you can copy and paste images into InDesign, it kind of creates a hidden link and things can get messy really quickly. So I recommend you actually save these images into this folder so everything is organized and well kept. You can also place images by going to File and then Place or Command D. This will open up a window where you can actually select images to place in, just like in Illustrator. I'm just going to select the second image and hit Open. And just like before in Illustrator, you get this little thumbnail of the image, and you can click and drag to make the image as big as you want it to be. In general, basically the most important thing about importing images into InDesign is making sure that you actually have all of your photos located in a folder that's well organized. To actually demonstrate the importance of having an organized folder for all your images, I'm actually going to take this first image that we dragged in and I'm just going to click and drag this outside of this folder and I'm going to put it in over here. So now it's no longer in this folder and we go back to InDesign. So while we can still see that this photo is here, we also have an error. So we're going to double click this pre-flight window. And when we open this up, we'll see that the missing link is this 5a.jpg. So while this image is technically still here, like you can still see it, that's only because your computer is smart enough to remember what was there earlier. It's actually quite a problem that there is a missing link. This missing link means that if you just go and print this, it's likely that the image won't print. Or if you send this file to a collaborator or a printer or something, or an external printer, they won't be able to actually print this page without the link of the image. So I'm just going to double click this. And it's going to take us to exactly where the problem is, just like we talked about last time. However, there's also another way you can relink multiple images at once if, for example, you actually needed to create a separate folder for all of these images, or you realize that you forgot to make a photos folder and you had to move everything into one folder. You can also go to the window links or Shift Command D. This actually shows you all of the photos and links that you use inside of your document, and it'll tell you when things are missing, like over here. So this says missing, double click to relink, so that's exactly what you can do. And we can go to our folder, and since we know that the image is here, we can go ahead and open this, and it'll relink your image. However, this is only best used when you're actually moving everything to a new folder. I would not recommend you do this if the actual image is misplaced. So here I'm actually just going to take this and drag this back into our folders folder. And we'll have to relink it again. So I'll just show you this again. InDesign is also smart enough that if, for example, we had both photos outside of the folder. If you just relink one and they're both in the same place, it will relink both of them. So that's relinking images, and I'm just going to close this window and also close this now that our errors have been cleared. So that's just about how you import images into InDesign. So the real funky thing about InDesign is resizing images. So for example, if I just have my sheep image selected and I go to the corner like you would in Illustrator and resize this image, you'll notice that it just masks out the image to that size. I'm going to hit undo real quick. Obviously, we don't always want our resizing to go like that. Most of the time, we're going to want to adjust our images proportionally just by using the transform tools. So there are a couple different ways that you can resize this image proportionally. The first is that you can actually resize the box to the size that you want. And then you can go up here in the top menu and there's a bunch of different sizing options over here. And they all look like different boxes with little corner squares. And here you can do different things with each one of these. So for example, fill frame proportionally. It'll fit the image to the frame without warping the image. I'm going to hit undo. You can do fit content proportionally, which does something pretty similar. I guess my frame is probably a bad size for this. If we do something that's a little bit more different from the original size, maybe you can see this more clearly. But for example, the fit frame proportionally actually makes it so that it fits to the left and right boundaries. And then the fit content proportionally does the same thing, but with the top and bottom frames. You can also do the next few, which do different things like stretching the image, wrapping the frame to the content, centering, and all sorts of different options. I will say that I tend to not use these just because I feel like there's a lot of effort in clicking through each of these. So I'm just going to undo back to our big image. What I normally do is actually hit Command and Shift while resizing the image. So you'll notice that this actually resizes the image proportionally, and we don't have to click through all of these and try to figure out which one to use. Another thing that you can do is use this auto fit. So this just, as it says, makes the content resize as the frame resizes. So if I click this on and I resize this image without pressing anything, you'll see that it actually fits to whatever the box is. Additionally, and I'm just going to turn this off real quick, if we resize the image like this, and then we just go ahead and click our fit content proportionally, if you don't want these excess boundaries where the image doesn't fill the frame, you can double click these boundaries just like with our type boxes and actually fit the frame to wrap the image. My recommendation would be to just get comfortable using the Command and Shift while resizing images because I find it to be the easiest. And you can even do a Command Option Shift to resize so it actually goes centered like that. So I guess you might be wondering why this is a function in InDesign at all, since it seems kind of unintuitive, I guess. So something that you actually can do with these functions of InDesign is I'm just going to hit W to go back to our gridded system. So for example, maybe we want this image to fit into our left page. And we want it to fit this height, but we don't want it to bleed over outside of the margin. Basically, the function of this is that when you resize this, it crops out these edges. And you'll actually be able to have this image fit in perfectly without having to export this image out, crop it in Photoshop, bring it back in, make sure it's the right size and all that. So it is a handy tool when you need it, and it is a little bit annoying when you don't need it. Additionally, this little circle in the center, you'll see that it turns into a hand tool when I hover over it. This will allow you to actually adjust the image within the frame, just sort of like you can adjust an image within a clipping mask with your direct selection tool. So if I click and move this, you'll see that the boundaries of this image actually turn blue, and you'll be able to move the image around so then it fits the frame exactly the way you want it to. If I move it a little bit away from the frame, you'll see that the frame of the image stays in the same place, but you're actually able to move the image within it wherever you want. So I'm just gonna move this back so it's slightly more centered. I will say that sometimes when you're moving your images around or adjusting your images, you might accidentally hit this in the middle and it gets a little bit annoying, but you always have the undo button, so it's not that big of a deal. With images, you also want to follow the grid like we talked about in the last week if you're using a grid. For example, this is an easy fix where we can just match it to these boundaries. Images, just like text boxes, can fit this modular system, which is really nice. And if you're planning on using the grid, images are probably actually easier to figure out on the grid than text can be. So moving on from importing photographs and images, we're going to be talking about a few other file formats. So the first one will be Photoshop files, and I'm just going to move to a new spread just for ease of understanding. And I just cleared that off. So if we go back to our Finder folder, I'm going to go into our Photos folder, and I'm going to drag in this Photoshop file that I created, and I'm just going to drag it into our InDesign folder. This gives us that little thumbnail, and I'm just going to click and drag it so it fits this frame generally. So this works totally fine, obviously, and you can use Photoshop files as essentially images within InDesign. I will say that if you have a finished Photoshop piece, it is best to actually export it as a JPEG or a PNG and then import it into InDesign just to save a little bit on file space. But if this is one of those projects where you're constantly editing these images while designing the actual book, it could be good to use the Photoshop files as placeholders. But let's just say we realize that there was something about the image that we actually needed to edit. So what we can do is select the image, right click, and hit Edit Original. So this will bring us into Photoshop directly because it is Adobe software. And you'll see all our layers are still here. Everything is all good. So for example, maybe we just wanted to change the background color. And I'm just going to turn this to black and hit OK. I'm going to hit Save like normal. And then when we go back into InDesign, this has already been changed. This can obviously be really helpful when you're working with Photoshop files. I guess a practical example could be if you were still making changes on your postcards and you had them as Photoshop files for some reason. I don't know why they wouldn't be in Illustrator file. You could edit those images in Photoshop and then bring them in here and then make changes and then constantly save them and then update them in InDesign. Again, though, with Photoshop files, you want to make sure that everything is linked properly. It will say the same thing here, just like images, and you want to make sure that it's in the proper folder or else you will lose it. So if any of you guys have started using InDesign, and I hope at this point you guys have jumped in and at least tested the water with this program, you might notice that it's a little bit difficult to make actual vector graphics in here. For example, I'm going to hit P on the keyboard to get the pen tool. The actual pen tool in InDesign is for some reason a little bit harder to use than in Illustrator. Changing colors is a little bit more difficult. Basically, the things that are really easy and breezy about Illustrator are a little bit more difficult in InDesign. And that's because InDesign is more of a tool to consolidate your elements and put them into a book, whereas Illustrator and Photoshop would be the place to go when you're actually creating those elements. So I'm going to hop over to Illustrator real quick, and I've created a few different elements here that we can bring into InDesign, and I'll show you exactly what happens to each of these. So you'll notice that my first one, this is just some type, and this has not been expanded, so this is still editable. This is just some vectoring that I did, and there is one stroke over here that has not been expanded. It is just the actual path. And this is kind of like our ultimate combo. So there's, you know, a vector shape, there's a few paths, and there's some type on top, and this hasn't been expanded as well. So let's take these in one by one, and we'll see what happens to each of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select our type, going to hit Command C on my keyboard to copy, and then I'm going to go back into InDesign. I'm just going to delete this shape since we don't need it anymore. And I'm going to hit Command V for paste. So obviously this is a little big, so we can resize this. Because this is a vector and not an image, we can actually just resize this without hitting the command while resizing. We can just hit Shift so it's proportional. So the first thing you might notice is that when we hover over this, the actual bounding box around it is dotted. This actually means that it is a group. So if I right click on this, you'll notice that I can hit ungroup, and I'm going to do that right now. So you'll see that actually this is kind of a mess and that there is a bunch of different groups over here and different elements. The Illustrator to InDesign connection does not always work perfectly, especially with type, because it actually vectorizes it somewhere in between and then makes them into these weird groups. So right now I can drag these pieces separate from each other. It's just really awkwardly spaced. Alternatively, what we're going to try now is we're going to go back to Illustrator, and I'm going to create outlines on this type before we import it in. I'm going to hit Command C and go back to InDesign. And when we bring this in and resize this down so we can actually see it on this page, when we ungroup it, it's actually separate letters. However, there is a little bit of an issue with these really crazy vector points. But if you're just bringing this in with no plans to actually edit the type, both of these options work totally fine. I would recommend, if you were bringing in vectorized type, to actually create outlines on it and then bring it in. You can also use our Pathfinder and actually unite all of these vectors so they're actually completely tight, and then bring this in again. And the reason why I say that is that the likelihood of you bringing in vectorized type like this would probably be for like a logo or something, or like a really specific type composition. And I would recommend you do it as tight as possible so there aren't any issues transferring it from Illustrator to InDesign. That being said, I would say that the only time you should be bringing in type from Illustrator to InDesign is when you're using something like a logo or something, and in general to just use the actual type tool in InDesign, because I would say type is probably the thing that InDesign does best, and you'll actually be able to get really great effects in here. So there's no use in risking the potential loss between Illustrator and InDesign unless it's something that's already vectorized. Going back to Illustrator, the next thing we're going to select is our little smiley face, and everything here has already been grouped together. So we're just going to copy it, and I'm going to bring it into InDesign. So here's my paste. So I'm just going to move it over a little bit. So like what I said before when I was introducing all those graphics, this smiley face is actually made up of several shapes and one path. So the first thing we're actually going to do is we're going to resize this and see what happens to this path. So making it very small. So you might notice that the actual stroke stays the same width because we didn't turn off the scale strokes and effects like you can do in Illustrator. So actually when you resize this smiley face, the paths will actually stay the same stroke width. That being said, if we ungroup this friend, you can see that this is still a path, and you can actually adjust the stroke width up here. You can also adjust each of these separate elements just like you would be able to in Illustrator. I find this to be one of the greatest things between Illustrator and InDesign, because in Illustrator you can obviously create much more complex illustrations and you can bring this in. As long as it's all vectors, you'll be able to create minor adjustments such as changing the color or stroke width within InDesign. I will say one thing though, if you're working with a lot of gradients, the gradients get messed up really easily when you bring them into InDesign. So I would actually recommend you to bring it in as a solid color and then change it to a gradient within InDesign, or actually just export it as like a PNG and a JPEG and then bring it into InDesign. Obviously, going back to our Illustrator file, I would recommend to actually go ahead and expand your strokes before bringing them into InDesign. And this way, if we bring this friend in to InDesign, when you resize it, the strokes will actually change and you won't have to worry about the proportions of your vectors changing. And finally, we're going to go into our last graphic that we have right here. So just copying this and bringing it into InDesign, you probably can guess what'll happen here. Resize down and bring it over. You can see that the strokes have still stayed the same. The vector resized normally. Ungroup all of this. The type has kind of this weird separation going on. So again, I would recommend you bring in these elements separately and to create outlines on this type before you bring it in, just so that everything is a solid vector. I guess I'll show you what happens with gradients real quick, just because we're here already. I'm just going to quickly turn this into a gradient. Okay, not the prettiest gradient, but we've got something here. So I'm just going to copy all of this again and bring it into InDesign. And I'm going to resize this. So already you can see that this gradient has changed. Just by resizing it once, the actual corner of this star has been affected. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and ungroup this. And real quick, I'm just going to delete all of these elements since they don't really affect it. And we're going to go directly into our star here. So when I hover over this, you might be able to tell that this is sort of similar to our images. There is an actual frame, which is the shape, and then there is an image inside, and that's actually the gradient. So we can move our gradient around here, and you'll notice that this is quite large. And we can actually resize the image inside down, or the gradient inside down, and move it around so then it fits better. But you also might notice that there's a couple different things going on in here. There is this image, the smaller one, and then a bigger one. And this is precisely why I would say do not transfer gradients over. It becomes a mess really quickly and it's just not great. Gradients in general are a little bit complicated in InDesign, so in general, I would recommend you, if you're using gradients, to actually make them in Illustrator, export it as like a JPEG or something, and then bring it in afterwards. So that's going to be it for this first part of this lesson. We talked about importing things into InDesign and pretty much wrap that up. So next we're going to talk about a few other tips for InDesign that are just going to be quick and easy. So I'll see you guys in that video.